Welcome to Get Rich Education. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. What does this CDC eviction ban really mean to you? Then an in-house discussion on the specific tactics you can employ to make your real estate purchase offer stand out above all the other offers in today's tight housing market. Today on Get Rich Education. Most rental property investors choose either positive cash flow or home price appreciation, but one real estate market can provide both. Jacksonville, Florida. With 9% lower home prices than the national median, 1% higher gross rents, and Jacksonville has appreciated 34% more than other comparable cash flow markets since 1991. Get positive cash flow today and appreciation for tomorrow. To invest for cash flow and growth in Jacksonville, go to cashflowandgrowth.com.
You're listening to the show that has created more financial freedom than nearly any show in the world. This is Get Rich Education.
Welcome to GRE, from Montpellier, France to Montpelier, Vermont, and across 188 nations worldwide. I'm Keith Weinhold. This is Get Rich Education. When the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, announced a rent eviction moratorium for the rest of the year through the Trump administration, a lot of people, perhaps you included, thought, what, a disease center can just cancel rent? Well, no, rent is not canceled for the rest of the year. It might have only sounded that way. So can landlords still evict non-paying tenants in the United States? The answer is yes, they sure can. But there is generally a halt to COVID-related evictions through the end of the year, through December 31st. Despite the big headlines, it only applies to tenants that specifically cannot pay rent due to COVID. So be mindful that despite higher unemployment, most tenants do still have jobs. To qualify for protection against eviction, what a tenant would need to do is fill out a declaration form and prove that they are at risk of being evicted and show a judge that they tried to get government help as well. So a tenant has to prove hardship. They even have to show that an eviction would render them homeless or having to sleep on someone's sofa, basically. Evictions for reasons other than not paying the rent, they can still move forward as well. Okay, so if your tenant has violated the lease for a reason other than non-payment of rent, maybe they let their brother stay with them for longer than what's allowed on your lease agreement. Well, in that case, yes, you can still evict them. Also, the moratorium, this particular eviction protection that we're talking about here, just with the CDC, that only applies to tenants that were financially eligible for a stimulus check back earlier this year. So that basically means that those with under $99K of annual income for single or couples filing jointly have a higher threshold. Even if a tenant proves to a judge that they truly can't pay rent due to COVID and an eviction is halted, the declaration form that the tenant has to fill out does indeed state that fees and penalties and interest for not paying on time will still apply based on what's in your lease agreement. So legally, the tenant would still be responsible for missed rent if they don't pay. So those are some of the conditions that really narrow the tenant precautions against eviction, and is definitely not any sort of cancellation of rent. I have got to give an acknowledgement to all those adversely affected by some of the worst wildfires in American history that have affected states on the West Coast. And how bad is it? Well, besides the loss of life and property, San Francisco, Portland, Oregon, and elsewhere have recently had the worst air quality in the entire world. That's according to CBS News. That is pretty frightening amidst what have been some really hard times for a lot of people this year already, amongst a global pandemic and civil unrest and a diminished economy and even an oil shock. Then there are the wildfires for some. The housing market continues to be one of the real bright spots anywhere, with bidding wars and escalating prices for a lot of properties. Let's talk with an active real estate agent and get the boots on the ground perspective on just what parts of today's housing market are the tightest, and then what an investor or even a wannabe homeowner needs to do with exactly how you write your purchase offer in order to make it stand out above your competition. Hey, it's really great to have Get Rich Education's own Aundrea Newbern on the show today. She does a lot to contribute here, like helping us book guests on the show and myriad other things. Aundrea was a longtime GRE listener before she joined us here earlier this year. She's a highly experienced real estate investor. She's got a substantial portfolio of her own. She's also an active real estate agent in her home market, and that is Brunswick, Georgia. Aundrea, welcome onto the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Keith.
Aundrea also owns an MBA in finance, so she's got a good formal understanding of real estate and economics too. And I often joke with her that she's more credentialed than me here at GRE. I've only got my humble bachelor's degree in geography and regional planning myself. So over the past few months, we've discussed here how the pandemic is affecting housing and the economy. We've done that through me. I've given you my own commentary on what I see to you, the listener. We've also had property managers, property providers, a few economists. And today I wanted Aundrea, being an active real estate agent, to share her insights with you on just how competitive today's housing market has become, because she works directly with buyers and sellers in today's market. But Aundrea, before we get into that, for some background here, tell us a bit about your own portfolio and what you own: single family homes, apartments. Tell us where you're coming from that way.
I've been investing now for about 5 years, Keith, and my portfolio is a little bit mixed. It's mostly single family homes. Most of my rentals are in the B class, some C plus, C minus as well. I do have a few duplexes and a couple of quadplexes as well. So it's a little bit of mix, but everything's 4 units or under right now.
Okay, a really good mix, utilizing that 1 to 4 unit space where you can get that long-term fixed interest rate debt for 30 years. Is it all long-term rentals, or do you do any short-terms by chance?
They are all currently long-term rentals. I have dabbled a little bit in short-term rentals, and I make a lot more money off of those than I do the long-term, but they're a lot more of a headache as well. So I've shifted out of that model.
Tell us some more about your typical tenant as well, including, are there any Section 8, any government subsidized housing tenants in your portfolio?
Great question. So I really actually love my Section 8 tenants. I do have a handful of those. It is not the majority of the portfolio. I am currently actually looking at increasing my Section 8 portfolio at the moment. However, most of my tenants are probably your B class, C plus, middle income, blue collar workers.
Yeah, government subsidized housing, that's Section 8. It's really interesting. That, I think, has more value in the marketplace than it did just 1 year ago with what's happened, where with Section 8, you often have 80% or more every month of that tenant payment being made by the government directly to you, the landlord.
You absolutely do. And I was really happy to have those Section 8 tenants when the pandemic hit, because I didn't have to worry about where my payments were coming from and if they were going to pay or not. So appreciate it a lot more now than I did a year ago, to your point.
Now, since you do own a lot of your portfolio right there in the local area, Brunswick, Georgia, what do you do about management? Do you self-manage some of them? Do you use professional management? Tell us about that.
That is also a great question. So currently at the moment, I do self-manage all of my properties. I have set up a lot of systems to make the process pretty easy. So there's not actually a lot of work that goes into it weekly. I do at some point, however, want to get to a point where I do shift that property management off to a third party just to be able to free up some of my time. But for me, for now, it's all me.
You're a person that's really good with systems, and you help us here at GRE with some of that knowledge that you have of systems. So yes, there are more tools for a self-manager today than there were back when I did my own self-property management. I only self-managed up to the point where I had 8 units. And as soon as I was about to get more than 8 units, even though they were all in my hometown at that point, that's when I outsourced management. But someone might be able to stretch that to more 15 or 20 units now and perhaps have the same workload with all of today's online management tools.
To me, it's actually not much of a difference between, say, 8 and 28. I haven't noticed that in terms of economy of scale, that it takes a lot more time each week. So, having 28 under management right now is certainly manageable. I think as I probably get up to that 40, 50, 60 mark, then I'll start looking at turning it over to a third party.
Before we talk about the temperature of the market, do you have any favorite online tools that you use, whether they're management tools or other tools for helping to organize your own portfolio? Any apps or websites?
So I currently use Buildium to manage most of my rentals at the time. In terms of applications, I use TransUnion SmartMove. They decision the applications or provide a recommendation per se within just like 30 seconds of the applicant submitting it. So far, I've never had to evict. I've never had to even give an eviction notice at this point. So I think TransUnion's doing a pretty good job with that background screening. But those are the top two that I would say I use.
Having a low eviction rate starts up front in that screening. So let's learn more about the temperature of the market. And I think part of the help that we're going to get with that is knowing just what kind of real estate agent or licensee that you are. What particular niche do you serve in that capacity? And is it owner occupied or is it selling rental properties to investors?
Most of the work that I do is with investors, local investors, people that are first-time investors or a little bit newer. I do offer kind of a full package where I teach them the ropes of investing. I do have some more experienced out-of-town investors that come into this area as well that I serve. In terms of just your residential, typical buyer or seller, I predominantly work with friends and family. I kind of keep my clients a little bit limited from that perspective so that I can serve investors a little bit more.
So we always talk about how the market is even more important than the property. And I think you're based in an interesting market there, Aundrea, Brunswick, Georgia. It is a market that's on the coast. You had mentioned short-term rentals earlier. You're trying that for a little while. It can really wear a person down with the extra time that it can take for sure. And now some short-term rental niches like Airbnbs and VRBOs have had more difficulty being resilient in the pandemic. So from that perspective, it's probably good and it's more stable that you're in the long-term rent as well. But the reason this is important with short-term rentals is when we talk about a coastal city, that is more conducive to those vacation type of rentals. But Brunswick, being positioned on the coast there in southeastern Georgia, as you go inland, you probably have more of these where the numbers work better for long-term rentals.
You do. So we have a couple different areas here. The first is called St. Simon's Island and Jekyll Island. Those are our touristy destinations where we get people from all over the U.S., predominantly from the tri-state area, that come in and want to do their beach vacations. So that's where most of the short-term rentals are prevalent. However, on the mainland, we've got a little bit of an interesting scenario. Here locally, we have a lot of people that work in the tourism industry and help serve those customers and clients that are coming in town. We also have something called the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, or FLETC as we call it locally. And that houses a lot of students such as customs agents, trainees that are coming in. It also hosts the instructors as well. When those individuals come in, especially the instructors, they're here for a year or more on assignment, and they're looking for those longer term rentals. So that's actually driven up the demand for long-term rentals here as well.
Yeah, this is interesting. So we're talking about southeastern Georgia, and you mentioned the tri-state area. Which three states does that pertain to, Aundrea?
So it's mostly South Carolina. We have a lot that come from North Georgia, but that's part of our state, so I won't mention that. Alabama, and then Florida as well.
To build a map in your mind's eye, we're talking about Brunswick, Georgia. It is about 80 miles south of the South Carolina border and 40 miles north of Florida border there on that coast. So we're talking about the Brunswick, Georgia. It is its own distinct MSA as defined by the Census Bureau. It has a population of about 150,000 people, depending on how you parse it. Because it is coastal, we do have an important port component of the economy there. Tourism's important. You mentioned the training site that's also there. So that's one of the housing dynamics. But the city itself has something like 15,000 people in that city of Brunswick itself. You did hear Aundrea right. She did mention Jekyll Island. So Brunswick abuts right up against Jekyll Island. And to any financial historians out there, you know that Jekyll Island is essentially where the Fed was created in the year 1910. So that's more of the lay of the land of Brunswick, Georgia.
Yes, it is. We get a lot of guests here that come actually for that specific reason to Jekyll Island. So it's a really neat place to visit if you're a historian or you're into history. I would highly recommend coming out here to take a look at that and look at some of the museums and whatnot.
Now, shortly before starting the chat with Aundrea this morning, I was on Zillow. I wanted to learn what the median home price of Brunswick, Georgia is. I found that it's $145,000. And of course, there are so many ways to parse that. You probably have these less desirable locations that are inland where you have a lower housing price. And then, of course, the more expensive ones as you get toward the coast and you get onto St. Simon's Island or you get onto Jekyll Island. But interestingly, within this Brunswick, Georgia market, where you can both get inland, where you probably have better cash flow, or you can get out onto the coasts, you've been seeing pretty interesting things that have been happening with the home prices in light of the pandemic, including some of the bidding wars. So tell us about more of that.
Things have gotten a little bit crazy here, as they have in a lot of markets as of late. So a couple of things that you pointed out that I think are really important. We do have almost two drastically different areas. So I mentioned St. Simon's Island and Jekyll previously. That's where a lot of our higher end, more expensive homes are located, rather than the mainland here in Brunswick. I predominantly serve the Brunswick area since I work with investors, very little on St. Simon's. So I'm going to speak to them as a whole, but there may be times that I kind of point out a little bit of differences between the two. Since May, which is when I ran some of my statistics this morning, our months of inventory have gone from 8.2 to 3.8 months in August. So it went from more of a buyer's market to a seller's market very quickly with limited inventory. And another thing that you mentioned was the average home price is about $145,000. If you include the entire county, which is St. Simon's, Jekyll, and Glenn County, which includes Brunswick, the median sales price have actually gone up to $350,000. From $260,000 back in May. So that big of a difference just over that amount of time.
There are some big differences there. So yeah, that 145K probably pertains just to Brunswick City proper.
Exactly, precisely. And we've also seen, to a couple of other points you've made, most of the homes that we sell are in that $100,000 to $200,000 range. That's where the majority of people can afford to purchase. And that is where we are starting to see those bidding wars. Price per square foot has gone up significantly. And appraisals, interestingly enough, are coming in at those increased sales prices that are oftentimes over the listing price as well.
I just want to give a reminder to the listener here. We happen to be keying in on Brunswick, Georgia, but the reason we're talking about this is emblematic of the population shifts that are occurring, emblematic of this migration pattern where people are looking to leave and vacate areas of the highly priced Northeast or coastal California where you have high taxes and you have high prices and people can work from home. So this is really just a litmus test for getting the temperature of what's attracting people and what people are willing to pay in these smaller, warmer, lower tax, lower cost markets. So with that context in mind, tell us more about the bidding wars. How crazy is it getting? Are places even able to be listed on the MLS? And are people bidding high for their investor homes or owner-occupied homes? Or tell us more about that.
So the answer is everything to that, Keith. So we're starting to see, to your point, a lot of migration from some of the larger cities into this area. You know, people are able to work from home, so they're not wanting to stay in Atlanta anymore, for example. They're coming down to St. Simon's to kind of have their beach life. So we're seeing that happen both with investor homes. We're seeing it happen with owner-occupied homes across the board. A little bit of an interesting story, something that happened to one of my clients a couple of weeks ago. We were getting ready to list their property, and this is in a residential neighborhood. This would not be an investor property. Haven't listed it yet, haven't put a sign up, and my client's just out jogging through his neighborhood, and he has a car stop him and say, do you know of any houses in this neighborhood that are coming up for sale? He said, actually, mine's going to be listed later today. House was under contract, full price, no questions asked, as is, before we even listed it on the market, and that's what we're starting to see here a lot now.
Like marketing zero prior to a sale. I mean, typically in marketing and sales, marketing activities are what leads up to a sale. And I think a lot of times what you're saying is you can skip the marketing.
You can, which is great for us real estate agents. So we're having to do a lot less work on our end, but houses are going under contract usually within 24 hours now.
Yeah, that's right. So I think a lot of people say the person that's worked in an insurance office in New York for a decade or two, and they always look forward to having that beach life in a warm place down the road, or even people to more proximus Atlanta desiring that beach life or that lower cost, slower pace of life. They can get what they've always wanted now.
You're absolutely right. And, the apartment that would cost you $500,000 to own, in downtown Atlanta or midtown Atlanta, you can get a huge home here very close to the beach for that same price with a 3% or less interest rate in a lot of times. So it's a great time to make that move.
So homes are being snapped up quickly, and that's whether we're talking about a single-family home for an owner-occupant or a rental home, duplex, or fourplex for an investor at just about the same frenetic rate, or what's really hot?
So really hot is the owner-occupied. Investment properties are actually very hard to come by. If you tried to get an investment property here a year ago, you could get a great 3-bedroom, 2-bath, long-term rental for under $100,000 that you could put a little bit of money into and then rent it for between $1,200 and $1,400.
Great numbers.
We're not finding that now. So you're having to find those off market if you want to buy those at that price.
Yeah, that's terrific. Now, are sellers having to give any concessions at all? For example, if a buyer makes an offer on a property, whether they're looking for an investment property or an owner-occupied one, and they want to put some things in there, for example, hey, I will pay full price, but I would like the seller to pay up to 2% of the purchase price in closing costs for me. Is that flying? Are sellers having to make concessions at all in a market like this?
No, not in the lower price properties. It is over asking price or at least asking price, no seller concessions. Now, when you start getting to those more expensive homes, $500,000 and above, you are seeing a little bit of seller concessions here and there, but still not like you did a few months ago.
Yeah. So when we talk about what is the hottest segment of that market, it sounds like it's that non-existent or very scarce inventory for that first-time buyer. And a lot of times those first-time buyer homes tend to be the ones that make the best homes for an investor to purchase and rent out to others.
That is absolutely right. And the median income here is around $50,000 a year. We also have about 17% of people living at or below the poverty line. So it's gotten increasingly more difficult for the people that are in those income brackets between poverty level and $50,000 a year to be able to find those first-time homes.
You're listening to Get Rich Education. We're having an in-house chat with our own Aundrea Newbern. More when we come back. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. The people that our listeners can't stop talking about are Ridge Lending Group and MLS 42056. They provided you with more loans than anyone. It's where I got my last few loans, and they finance single-family income property up to fourplexes. They're the #1 lender for both beginners and veterans. Start your pre-qualification, chat with President Chaley Ridge personally, and you'll end up with your custom plan for expanding your cash flowing portfolio. Start at ridgelendinggroup.com. Fortunately for you, Congress has made it possible to get up to $200,000 out of your current 401k or TSP to invest in real estate or your own business, and that's even if you're still working. The thing is, you can get all this money tax-free. The EQRP is your secret weapon. With the CARES Act expiring soon, the EQRP company helps you unleash your retirement funds now. Learn more and text message QRP in all capital letters to 72,000.
Check this out, G. This is Flavor Flav in the building for my man Keith Weinhold to your powerful Get Rich Education podcast. And you reached 3 million listeners? Congratulations, man, on your podcast. For you, Keith, rock the house, G.
Oh, wow. Just amazing to hear directly from Rock and Roll Hall of Famer Flavor Flav, the hype man of Public Enemy there. Yes, indeed, G. This show did hit the 3 million listener download milestone last week. Hearing those congratulations from Flav is pretty cool. Oh, does it get any better than this? You're listening to the show that's created more financial freedom for busy people just like you than nearly any show in the world. This is Get Rich Education. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. We're doing something a little different today. We're having an in-house chat with Aundrea Newbern, and it's a great way for us to get a temperature of the market because she is an active real estate agent, and she works in a geography that's really one of those more desirable areas for in-migration, where that condition has really accelerated in the pandemic. So, Aundrea, tell us more about the income property market there, since that is one of those investor advantage markets that just doesn't get talked about a whole lot. It was some of the dynamics that we're seeing for tenants and renters and occupancy rates and things like that.
So one of the reasons I actually picked this market, not just because it's my hometown, because the rental rates here are quite high. It's around 35%, which is a little bit higher than the average for the state of Georgia. And so we do have a high rental demand here. The majority of people seem to want single family homes, but they're a little bit more expensive here than, say, a multifamily apartment would be. Just depends on where the income level is. So I would say the majority of my tenants do come into those single family homes. I'd mentioned before the average rent's going to be anywhere between $1,200 to $1,500, depending on what type of property it is that I own. The interesting thing that I love here is that I never have vacancy. And so what I mean by that is from the time one tenant moves out, if they even move out, usually I have them for years and years on end, from the time they move out to the time the next tenant comes in, my average turnaround time is 3 days right now.
That is astounding, especially when you have the high retention rate, which you would tend to do when you have single family homes in smaller apartment buildings.
Yes.
The 35% that you mentioned, that is the proportion of locals that rent their home versus the 65% or so then, the flip side of 35 that own their own home?
That is correct.
Yeah, so that is a little bit higher rental rate than the national average for sure. Have you seen any increases in rent amounts between tenants? Because, of course, you get to see this from a couple sides. You get to see this as both an agent serving clients and in your own portfolio.
Yeah, great question. So I would say that I haven't necessarily seen that directly due to COVID impact. I can tell you from my own personal portfolio, I've maintained the rent levels that we're at so that I can keep these tenants that are paying on time and are great tenants. I haven't had increases. In this area as a whole, the last 2 to 3 years, we've seen about anywhere from a 15 to 20% increase in rents for single family homes. So it's been quite drastic, actually, which we haven't seen incomes rise at that same level. So in some ways, it's becoming problematic for some of the locals that need rentals here.
That's astounding. And yeah, this sounds like good news to you if you're a real estate investor. But of course, the flip side of that is this is not good if you're a tenant or you're a prospective buyer and you want to rent or own a place. And this is just emblematic of the chronic housing shortage that we have nationally. We're about 2.5 million housing units short of what's needed in the United States. And that's certainly going on here. So this is great. You have like these flash brief periods of vacancy even between tenant turns. You're telling me about as little as 3 days. Does that mean that you also see waiting lists for tenants that want to rent a vacant property? Is that occurring anywhere?
Yeah, so I usually market my properties as soon as I get the notice, and I do require the notice 60 days where they can give it 60 days before they vacate. And I almost never, within the first 30 days, am not able to rent it. So within 30 days of listing that property, I have it rented. And I oftentimes do have people reaching out to say, hey, I know you rented this property. What do you have coming up? And I'll put them down and they'll be the first person I contact for the next rental that comes available. So yes, we do have that.
And waiting lists are a phenomena that clearly put upward pressure on rent prices. Say that you, the listener, own property and you have 10 people on a wait list for your next vacancy. Those 10 people on that waiting list are waiting to pay a projected rent of $1,300 and your wait list is too long. Well, what would be a way for you to shorten your wait list? You raise your rent from $1,300 up to $1,400 and then you see your wait list go to $5,000. Problem solved, rent increased.
You are absolutely right. And that is something that we have done occasionally.
So, Aundrea, really bottom line, actionable takeaway. In your opinion, what should a prospective buyer do in this hot real estate market that we have today in order to make their purchase offer stand out above all the other offers that are out there?
That's a really good question too, Keith. So there's a few things that I've seen done and that I've also done with some of my clients. The first one is make sure you do your due diligence when you're picking an agent. Make sure that you're picking someone that has a good professional relationship. They're courteous and quickly responsive to you also. The selling agents often have quite a bit of sway with their buyers, and they will influence who the seller chooses.
Good point.
They're going to want to work with the people that they know and they know can get the closing done and they know are going to be easy to work with. So that's probably the top tip I would have for the due diligence. The second one there would be write a letter. Explain to the seller who you are, why you think this is the perfect home for you. Make it personal, so make them understand who you are and know you. If you don't want to write a letter, a video could even be better so that they can actually see you and see your family and kids if you have any.
Sometimes it's coming down to who's got the best smile in the video for who's going to get the deal in a hot market.
That's absolutely true. The other thing related to the photo or the video is if you're going to an open house, sometimes with these hot listings, they only have open houses. They don't do a lot of showings outside of that. Have your agent take a photo with you in front of the house, and you can attach that to the offer letter as well to make that a little bit more personal also. One of the others would be make sure that your listing agent, if you're open to using the listing agent's preferred title agent or closing agent or lender, let them know that and say, as part of the offer, we'll use who you guys want for those different vendors. They like working with those, and they may help sway your offer a little bit from that perspective also. And then another way is to offer more money. So put down a higher earnest money than the typical 1% to 2%. That way they know you're serious, that you're invested, and you have some money down on that offer.
Okay, so not necessarily more in the purchase price in this case, but even at the same purchase price, offer more earnest money, show that prospective seller that you are serious.
Exactly. And of course, offering more money over the asking price is almost imperative in some of these instances nowadays. So that's not even a consideration. You have to do that. But that higher earnest money is not something that we see very often. The other thing is add an escalation clause to the contract. And what that means is this is where the buyer will state, that they'll pay a certain price for the home over any other higher offers that are received by that seller. So, for example, if you're paying $200,000 for a home, that's what your offer's for. The seller gets another offer at the same time for $205,000. You'll go over that at $206,000, and you're willing to do that automatically with no questions asked.
And that shouldn't put the prospective buyer at risk because that information will be confidential.
That's right. Exactly.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've been investing in real estate more than 18 years, and I've never used an escalation clause like what you just talked about, but potentially, I don't know that inventory has ever been lower in my entire life, especially for the product types we're talking about in this entry home buyer range or this investment property range like we're talking about here.
That's right. And it's become more common the last few months. It wasn't as common even a year or two ago as it is now. The other thing is have your agent go ask the listing agent what it will take for them to accept your offer that day. Sometimes just asking, they'll tell you more information than you ever would expect that'll help you get some insider information on what they expect in that contract. So that's another really good one.
That's interesting, and that's so simple. Just have your buyer agent ask the listing agent, what would it take to get an offer accepted today?
Exactly. And that also goes back to the agent being courteous and professional. If they have that good working relationship, that listing agent will probably be more open with them as well. So another one is stating that you'll pay up to X amount out of pocket if the appraisal comes in lower than what your contract price is. So we mentioned oftentimes now there's bidding wars and, the price will be, say, $200,000. The accepted offer is $220,000. But it is possible it won't appraise at $220,000. So if you have the ability to pay out of pocket that additional $20,000, state that in the contract so they know your offer is going to be solid, irrespective of the appraised price.
I know a lot of appraisals are coming in strong today too, but that's interesting. So for that prospective seller, you've just taken some doubt out of their mind because if that seller's property appraises for less than the contract price, you've already put it in writing that you will come out of pocket up to a certain ceiling in order to make up for that. So therefore, you've made it easier for that seller to say yes to your offer as a buyer.
That's absolutely right. It's happening all the time now. The last one that I'd probably leave with you is consider waiving the inspection. I know that's a little bit risky at times, but people are doing it now just so that they can get their offer accepted. It's not necessarily waiving your due diligence period, but let them know you're willing to just bypass what's found on the inspection unless it's something major. There's kind of different ways you can play that, but we're starting to see that be a very common trick now as well.
These are some takeaways in order for you, the buyer, to make your offer stand out above and beyond all other buyers in today's hot real estate market. Well, Aundrea, it's been great having you here. If anyone wants to reach out to you, what's the best way for them to get a hold of you?
That would be Aundrea at GetRichEducation.com.
Aundrea, it's been a fun chat about taking the temperature of today's pandemic-driven housing market. Thanks so much for coming on to the show here.
Thank you for having me, Keith.
Oh, great to get the value directly from our own Aundrea today. Hey, it's great to surround yourself with sharp people. I'll tell you, around here, sometimes I think that she needs to tell me what to do. If you'd like to reach out to her, Aundrea is spelled Aundrea at GetRichEducation.com. One thing for you to keep in mind with statistics is that remember to look at the story behind the numbers, like I often talk about here. Don't let statistics lie to you. Yes, many home prices are appreciating now, but when you see median home prices go way, way up in a short period of time, there can often be more to the story. For example, if you see a 30% increase in an area's median home price year over year, keep in mind that in the pandemic, a lot of markets are seeing more demand for homes that have more square footage because people want more space in the pandemic. So if home prices do jump 30%, but see the average home sold has 20% more square footage, well, now you begin to get the idea. Maybe on a square footage basis, prices of homes are only up 8% or 10%. So if you see this pandemic-driven spiking price rise, look a little beyond the superficial appreciation rate alone to see the full story that the numbers are really telling you, and Aundrea will tell you the same thing. So though she heads up the operations here at GRE, she also maintains that active agent license in her home market in Georgia. To give you a quick review of her most actionable gems today to make your purchase offer stand out, if you enlist an agent, which usually in that case then would mean that you're not buying turnkey, make sure you choose a buyer agent that's going to behave professionally and show some courtesy to the seller agent over there on the other side, since that seller agent often has a good bit of sway and can influence who the seller chooses to sell that home to. Agents that work well with others often get that preference. Also, if you want to buy, consider writing a letter to the seller, or even better, send a video explaining why you are the best buyer. Also, get an advantage by telling the listing agent that your buyer will use that seller's preferred title agent or closing agent and lender. You can offer a higher earnest money deposit than that typical 1 to 2% of the purchase price. Another tactic, add an escalation clause to the contract. I think this is an interesting maneuver for you to consider, where if you're the buyer, you state that you'll pay X price for the home, but if the seller receives another offer that's higher than yours, then you'll increase your purchase price to an amount above that competitor buyer's offer yet. That's an escalation clause. Another tactic that's so simple, just have your agent ask the listing agent what it would take to get an offer accepted on this very day. So rather than complicate things, simply ask for what you want to know. Yet another option, if you have the financial wherewithal to do it, is that you'll pay up to X amount out of your pocket if the appraisal comes in lower than the contract price. That is a recap of the specific tactics you can employ to make your real estate purchase offer stand out above all of the others in today's tight housing market. One reminder for you active real estate investors is really something that I've needed to remind myself of. It isn't just your tenants, but it's your property managers whom you might want to give some more slack to these days. Property managers, they've had to make pandemic adjustments, so they're often hustling harder. And then in the pandemic, based on your situation, you, the investor, at the same time might have more time to look over your portfolio and your monthly management statement and ask your manager questions. I know that I've got a property manager or two that's a little backed up in replying to me during this exceptional time. Next week on the show, learn how fintech, financial technology, is changing the face of real estate investing and more as a PhD professor from New Jersey at one of the nation's leading research institutions joins us to help keep you informed about that. For Aundrea Newbern and Flavor Flav, I'm Keith Weinhold. Hey, if you like this show, I'd love it if you tell a friend about Get Rich Education. Don't quit your daydream.
Nothing on this show should be considered specific, personal, or professional advice. Please consult an appropriate tax, legal, real estate, financial, or business professional for individualized advice. Opinions of guests are their own. Information is not guaranteed. All investment strategies have the potential for profit or loss. The host is operating on behalf of Get Rich Education, LLC exclusively.
The preceding program was brought to you by your home for wealth building, GetRichEducation.com.